This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. You can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. Did you notice our updated theme tune? A big thanks to Elizabeth Usher, also known as MC Pony, for putting that together for us. You can find out more about Elizabeth by going to her website, which is veganthused.com. That's vegan, THUSED.com. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by AASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. You can join AASA today for only $60 Australian if you're a waged academic, and there's also a concession rate of $15 Australian. Membership comes with all kinds of benefits. For example, members receive both the Animail magazine and the fortnightly AASA update, with funding opportunities, calls for papers, news about recent publications, and more. This episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. This is a collection of scholarly books focused on animal studies. If you haven't already, you should take a look through the books that the series has to offer on the Sydney University Press website. And be sure to contact your university library or local library to ask them to carry a copy of any titles that interest you. Now, I was introduced to today's guest by a colleague at the University of Minnesota Press, who reached out to me to tell me about the book we're going to be talking about today, and I couldn't resist. Professor Ron Broglio works in the Department of English at Arizona State University. He's authored or edited a number of books on animal studies, as well as producing or curating a number of art exhibitions exploring human-animal relationships. His books include Surface Encounters, Thinking with Animals and Art, which was published in 2011 by the University of Minnesota Press, and 2018's Edinburgh Companion to Animal Studies, which he co-edited with Lynn and Undine Sellbach. Today, however, we're going to talk about his 2022 book, Animal Revolution, from the University of Minnesota Press, which features illustrations by Marina Zurkow and an afterword by Eugene Thacker. Welcome to the podcast, Ron.
Pleasure to join you.
So can you start by telling us what led you to write about the topic of animal revolution?
As we probably all notice, we see these one-offs where, dog bites owner sort of thing. In this particular case, I'd seen these sheep in the Midlands who, there was an article about them in local newspaper, and they got to a cattle guard, and one of the sheep saw the cattle guard, got down, and rolled over it. And the other sheep, being sheep, followed, rolled over, and went to greener pastures and, were out in the great open. And the newspaper article described it as a commando roll. I thought, okay, this is a bit of revolutionary gear here. And then, of course, there's the famous George Orwell's Animal Farm, where it's this push against the human. But it's really so overladen as an allegory. So I was reading on the origins of Animal Farm, and apparently he was in Eastern Europe, and he saw this, as he tells it, he saw a young boy whipping a cart horse brutally, and he thought, if only this horse knew its strength, what it could do. And then he says it was just like the working class and the bourgeoisie. And I thought to myself, well, he's done it again. He's left the animal out. He's just whipping the animal and using it. When is the animal going to get its day? And so that was my impetus to begin collecting these stories. I've been doing this since about 2005, and then eventually putting them into a book of creative nonfiction.
Yes, and you're right that it's the stories that stay with you after reading this book. In some ways, this isn't really a traditional academic book at all. It's more a collection of snippets taken from newspapers, academic studies, fiction, and even in some cases, your own life. So I thought it might be a fun thing to start with if you just introduced us to a few of these stories, perhaps the ones that stick in your own head from the book.
Right, yes. And so the idea is to provide a litany. And the role of the litany is it's a series of things, big and small, as if they're coming from everywhere, to give the impression for the reader that this is happening, that it's just out there. And my sort of gambit in this is the animals are in revolt against humans. And why wouldn't they be? So they're pushing back. We don't know it, but I've been in the field. I've seen these things. I've pieced all these pieces together. And then all of a sudden, when you look around after reading the book, you start noticing, wait a minute, there's an incident and there's an incident. And it opens one's eyes. So some of the little vignettes that stick out for me is the jellyfish that stopped the largest USS aircraft carrier, the USS Ronald Reagan. The Reagan was in port in Australia, Brisbane. It's a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, so it can go 25 years at sea without having to refuel. And it was at port simply just to let the crew stretch its legs. These jellyfish, a large jellyfish bloom comes in, and they get sucked up by the intake valve for this aircraft carrier that needs the seawater to cool the nuclear reactors. And all of a sudden, there's more and more and more of them getting sucked into this portal. And I describe it like the original Star Wars with the Death Star, and there's this one portal that is the entryway to destroy the Death Star. So they're sucked into this portal, and they basically have so many jellyfish and so much goo and so much tentacles that they jam the ability for water intake to cool the reactors. And the whole systems have to shut down, go to emergency power, call in fire departments, and really close them out. So that's one of them. And I like that in some ways to another one, which is the radioactive boar in eastern Germany. The boar are radioactive because of the fallout from Chernobyl, and they eat the tubers that have absorbed much of the radiation. Then, of course, most people have evacuated this zone of radiation, but the boar are mobile and take their radioactive bodies into eastern Germany. The idea being that it's a return of the repressed. While we want to forget our disasters, these animals feel them, they embody them, and they return it to us to remind us. So our eyes are on progress, but they're reminding us of what we've done to the earth itself.
I'll ask you more about some of these stories in a second, but I really like what you say about how you're collecting these stories, these vignettes, these interactions between humans and animals to paint a picture of revolution going on around us. I realise that your academic background is in literature, so let me ask what might be a fairly blunt question. How literally should we take your idea of animal revolution?
Right. So this is the playful tongue-in-cheek element. I've been working with Marcus Coates, who's a British artist, and he's done a number of things, one of which is shamanistic rituals for various communities in Europe. And he goes and he asks them a question. He says, I'm going to go to the lower world, and I will take your question there and ask the animal spirits, and I'll bring back an answer in the form of that story. And if you ever see one of his performances, you realize, well, I'm not sure. Is this real? Is he really having these visions? And that sense of unknowing and both wanting to believe but not sure, and this back and forth for the audience, and for my case, the reader, is what I'm really interested in. So one catches oneself, well, do I want a revolution? Is there a possibility of revolution? And so it's that participatory element in reading. And then, of course, what constitutes a revolution. And I say this at the beginning with a manifesto, is we have a particular idea or definition of a revolution, and Marxists will quibble with my use of the term. But as I say, it's their revolt, it's their pushback against us. And we don't have a language or a name for what they're doing because it's theirs. And to name it is to appropriate it. So I give it this very sort of general idea and general translation, which is revolution.
I see. And it's interesting that you've left it wide open whether this is a metaphor or whether it isn't. I guess you've left it open as something for the reader to negotiate themselves. Let me share some of my thoughts that I came to from reading these stories, and this of course reflects my own background as a political philosopher. But it strikes me that there are quite different things going on in these various stories. So I can definitely understand the revolutionary element in chimps throwing rocks or the animals who escape from enclosures. I think it's less clear when it comes to your example of the cane toads, who seem to be involved in a rebellion or a revolution through simply breeding where they're not wanted. And then the jellyfish that you mentioned seem to be doing something different again. They're literally sucked into a ship, so maybe they're sucked into a revolution, but they're not choosing to be part of the ship or the revolution themselves. Or that's what it felt like to me. So I wonder whether there's something. Well, you're smiling at me now. So I wonder whether there's something quite cheeky going on in the way that you throw these examples together under the same banner.
Right. Each is called in its own way, Josh. Some take the mantle and some is thrust upon them. So the great thing with animals, and it's true really for all of us, I come from a history of phenomenology, which looks at how we embody thought and being in a landscape. And in Surface Encounters, that book is to ask the question, what is an animal phenomenology? How do animals think about their embodiment in a landscape? And how do artists interact with that? In this book, I take the idea of embodiment seriously, embodied thought seriously, that the animal in its very corporality and activity is displaying its thinking. It is its thought. And so, whether voluntarily or not, this idea of a physicality that pushes up against our human world is the modality by which they show a resistance and resist and insist upon their own space, their own world. I say repeatedly in the book that humans and animals are in different worlds, different perceptual worlds, different thought worlds, but we have a shared earth. And it's in that shared earth that there's this jostling and rubbing and bumping against each other. So in some ways, as you said, with the chimps, it feels much more willed and volitional and an escape from the closure. But in other cases, what I'm asking is, are we in their human way of creating the world and weighing upon the world? Are we creating enclosures of the animal world? That is, we occupy the airways. If a bird runs into an aircraft and it takes it down, it's asserting its airspace. The same with bees and birds who attack drones or mechanical drones. Those drones are occupying their space. The shark that bites through an underwater cable and cuts off internet connections. That shark is saying, this is my world too. And I'm curious about this fleshy thing that's producing these different waves and vibrations.
It's striking that you use this idea of shared space because that leads us quite neatly to one of the ideas that you deploy in the book, which is hospitality, something that you borrow from Derrida. So could you introduce us to the idea of hospitality as you deploy it and the part that it plays in your vision of animal revolution?
Right. So Derrida of hospitality, and I tell a little story about Derrida and how he might have come to some of these ideas, because in his own life he really struggled with the issues of hospitality. He was coming from Northern Africa into France as a Jew and as an outsider, and was not always welcome. So he had this tension of hospitality in his own life. Then, when he writes of hospitality, he asks this question, and he's looking at limits. He says, well, there's the absolute idea of hospitality, that I will say yes to whoever comes. It can be, if it's a friend, it's easy to be hospitable to a friend. That's what friendship is. But what if it's an enemy? What if it's someone I don't know? What if it's a non-human? And at that point, he says, that would be a radical hospitality. That would stretch the there's this absolute of hospitality. Then he says, if we look at our actual laws, what migrants are allowed in, how we handle negotiations between countries, those show us the practical limits. And there's a tension between this absolute or ideal and the practical laws. So this universal demand and the practical. And what I look at in the sections on hospitality, and it runs through the book really, is how we are negotiating between the physicality of these details in the world, all these vignettes that display the details of these problems of hospitality, and then these ideals, something to aspire to. What would be this radical openness? For example, the woman who opens her house to rabbits and houses hundreds of rabbits. And all of a sudden she realizes this is not my house with them living in it. It's their house and I'm their guest within that space. And she really changes the center of this question of dwelling. So if we think about the environment as usually human-centered in everything that surrounds us, instead, she decenters the human, places a center with the animal, and she's at the periphery. I find that a really compelling comportment or a way of embodying and engaging with the world and thinking differently. So one of the things I'm trying to do throughout is to open this sense of wonder. Think of what's possible. Think of all these animals in the ways that they sense differently, see differently, embody the world differently. And if we listen radically to that, really engage in listening to that and take that in, it allows us to expand our ways of thinking and dwelling and being with others. Because often we live within the narrow parameters of rational thought, rational cultural European thought. And it's good to be jostled outside of that and realize that there's a bigger earth out there.
Now, this reminds me of what I thought was one of the most memorable passages in the book. It's from the chapter called Bearing Witness. So let me just read that passage and then I'll ask a question. I believe, say those who look to the stars for alien life or peer deep into the woods for signs of Bigfoot. We have an array of cultural myths about animals. Believe these myths and take them seriously. Activate them. They're not allegory or fantasy. They are here and now. They are values and ethics and actions. Now, I really like the sound of that, but let me simply ask, what does it mean?
I had so the story of, I will get to what that means. I was writing the book, and my dear friend Matt Bell, who just came out with a book, Appleseed, which I highly recommend. And it was sort of a top 10 summer read for New York Times and the New York Times list, that has a human animal in it as the protagonist. He's my writing coach. And I'd finished the manuscript, handed it to him, said, okay, have a look. And he had been reading throughout. Reads it and says, okay, it's good. You could publish it, but you can go further. Says you only get to publish this. You only get to write Animal Revolution once. You only get to, you write other books. It's fine, but you got one shot at this. Put everything in it. And then he says, how are you implicated in this revolution? And I thought, wow, okay, academics normally don't write about themselves. And that's putting something different on the line. It's risking something different. And I thought, wow, that's a huge gambit. And so you read from the end of that chapter, which is about my own sort of physical engagement and belief in a relationship with a variety of animals. What I'm doing there is I'm activating something that was existent within European cultures. And here I'm in the Southwest of the United States in Arizona, which has the most indigenous tribes. And it's certainly active within their cultures, even to today. And these are shamanistic beliefs and totemic beliefs of an engagement with non humans, right? So there might be a particular animal that the human is named in honor of, or that the human is told they have a special tie with through an encounter or a clan, whatever it might be. So we've had these stories for a very long time. Eduardo Cohn in How Force Thinks talks about this as well. The book Becoming Animal, the author of Spell the Sensuous, David Abram, talks about it in Becoming Animal. It's the idea that we always live under belief systems. Our current belief system is one of a particular idea of rationality in science, which benefits us in many ways, but provides that has other blind spots to it. One of the blind spots we're inheriting now, which is the extinction of species and global warming and weighing on the earth in adverse ways. So we've inherited the blind spots from our belief system. What I'm suggesting here is that we have had and can activate these other belief systems that allow us to have an embodied way of engaging with the non-human world that makes our lives and their lives more valuable and more ethical.
I see. And I guess this question of your own engagement comes up in the question of joining the revolution or in being an ally to the revolution. On the very first page of the book, you mentioned that you've tried handing weapons to animals. I don't know how metaphorical you're being there, but I suspect that gives an indication of your answer to my next question. But I'm going to ask it anyway. There's a really fascinating paper published by the late Bernard Williams criticising Peter Singer's anti-speciesist ethics. I'll not try to summarise Williams' arguments here, but at the end of his paper he asks us to imagine an alien invasion and a war between humans and aliens. He asks provocatively whose side we'd be on. I think his point is that obviously we'd be on the side of the humans, and this tells us something interesting about human-animal interactions. Now, I think there's a good few problems with the argument that Williams is making in that paper, but let me just put the same kind of question to you. If the animal revolution against humans begins, or as you say, if it's already begun, whose side are you on?
That's fabulous. It's not going to be most humans. I'm going to say that. If anything, the animal revolution is a corrective to the way we engage with the world. And it asks us to take the animal world really seriously and to give them that space. Now, E.O. Wilson has said, give them half the world. Give them some space. Can we have a negotiated treaty? In Michel Serres' Natural Contract, he asks, what is the language by which the earth speaks? It speaks in this physicality. So it is trying to negotiate a contract with us. Just like we have a social contract, he says we need a natural contract. And so this pushback in a revolution, in a war, is to eventually, ideally, reach a space where we can say, okay, I hear you and I respect that you too have some space. And let's develop that relationship. And it doesn't have to be a winner take all. Although if it was, I'm not sure that I'm on the side of the humans. We've had our moment. And by the way, the animals are patient. So 1 or 2 generations, many hundreds will die. But eventually, animals will be around they've been around longer, they will be around longer than us. Not particular species, not individuals, but the animality of animals, right?
I like what you say about it not necessarily being a winner takes all situation. I guess that also means we don't have to spend too much time picking our side or putting on our uniforms. But there's another way of asking the same kind of question, and that's how you finish the book. So, one of the things you address in the closing pages is the question of whether we are staunch allies or wayward occasional advocates for animals. Those are your words. So, how can we be staunch allies, do you think?
On our best days, this goes back to this issue of hospitality, right? That we have these ideals of wanting to be the staunch ally. But in our daily lives, we have a lot going on. We have our own worlds and our own way of being. And we often find ourselves falling a bit short of what we'd like to do or be able to do. Look, if I could go every day and protest at zoos, and I've written papers about this. I think we don't need zoos. I think we need shaman. I think we need a way of engaging that is not Linnaean categories with animals behind bars, but instead a cultural modality by which we try to connect with the animal. So there are plenty of opportunities that would like to get engaged with, but also we live in a very human world, an all too human world, and we feel dragged down by that and reminded of it quite often. So I'm also aware of that, and I'm aware of our shortcomings in that regard. But one of the things that strikes me, and I'm sure the listeners have experienced this, you've experienced this, is when you bring up the question of the animal, most people look at you really quizzically. Like, why would we spend government funds on animals? Think of our children. They need better education. We need better roads. We need all these things. And it's, what about our future? And I say, I think we're going to be all right. What about these other futures? And looking out for their future, in fact, might be even looking out for ourselves in a larger ethical sense.
Before we move on to our regular questions, I wanted to ask you about an element of this book that's quite unusual among the books that I look at for knowing animals. And that's that it's full of pictures. There's all these pictures of strange animal human object hybrids. So, can I ask what led to the book including these illustrations?
Right. So these are, as you mentioned in the intro, by Marina Zurkow, who's a New York artist. And I've known Marina for a while. She does incredible illustrations and engagements with the environment and human problems in the environment. And one of the things that she's really good at is to create these almost surreal pictures that are both humorous and have a dark seriousness to them. And that's much of the book, which is humorous stories, really kind of fun, interesting, quirky stories, but then taken seriously, realize, wait, there's this darker element of problems with this, which is why I have Eugene Thacker do the afterword, given his cosmic pessimism. So I asked her to read the manuscript, see if she liked it, and she'd be game to do some images. She really enjoyed it, flew to Arizona, and I got her some studio space, and she just started drawing. And once she got a formula down and a rhythm, she created these surreal engagements where animals have these human apparatus and there's human animal hybrid elements. And what's interesting about them is they're not direct illustrations of the chapter. They're both illustrations of moments, but also commentaries that I remember as a child reading these Hardy Boy books where you would look at you'd be halfway through the chapter and you're waiting for something to unfold and you see a picture and you realize it's the picture of one of the key element in the book. And so it compelled me to read more. And then that's the same thing. I want the reader to pick up the book, see a picture, and say, wow, I wonder what's happening here. I want to dip into that section. So the book's roughly divided between, especially in the beginning, it's more animal vignettes. And in the second half, it's more how humans can engage and interact. But overall, you can pick it up and enter anywhere within the book and read around, skip chapters, etc. It's a short book, and Josh, I think you read it almost all in one sitting. So it's a quick read, and it's meant to be that way. It's meant to be just engaging in a way that thought moves at different speeds. So it allows you to think at different modalities, different speeds.
Yes, I agree. And I think this is one of those books I'd be happy to read on my day off. I'd happily sit in the sunshine and read this rather than sitting in the office and read it. So it does feel a bit more like the books I read in my spare time, even while it retains that academic flair, that critical edge, which is what we want from our best academic work. So it's really a different book to what I normally feature on the podcast. Now, Ron, I ask every guest 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Okay, bring them on.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
I was at Georgia Tech. I was doing a teaching fellowship before getting a tenured job. And one of the other teaching fellows was Susan McHugh, who some of you may know, who runs a series with Palgrave on animal studies and is a great animal studies scholar. This was when she was first writing her first book on dogs. And so I was reading early chapters of that before they were published. We were sharing work. And I was writing on cattle at the time because I was interested in landscape aesthetics of the 18th and 19th century in Britain. And she said, this is really animal studies work. And so we then had that engagement. She talked about dogs, not from the human perspective, but how she saw the dog perspective, and really pushed me to think of my work in those same terms. And so I'm really, really grateful to Susan for that.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
The first thing I did was called Romantic Cow. And I remember giving this first as a paper at the Modern Language Association, which is sort of a big conference for a number of fields. And people didn't know what to make of it. It's like, what do you mean romantic cows? And of course, cows are hugely important and not talked about. And I said, why are we always just talking about ourselves? And there are these other animals, and they have an important role. Erica Fudge, of course, has written about this extensively in her essay Left-Handed Blow in a collection by Nigel Rothfeld. It's an early example of the ways people have problems engaging with animal studies. In any case, I was in a tenure track job at the time, and I remember my head of the department looking at me. He said, "What are you working on?" I said, "Well, cattle in Britain. I got this romantic cow thing going." And he said, "Why would you write about animals?" I thought to myself, "Well, this is not the department I belong in." And sure enough, it didn't end well there. But we were many of us very early on in animal studies. There was no animal studies that was recognized academically, and so we were getting these pushback questions of why would you write about this? Why were you engaged with this? And this is, myself and Susan and Steve Baker and a number of other folks.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
One of them has been Kerry Wolf. Kerry's an ally and a friend, known him many years. We go hiking in Colorado together every year. He comes to Arizona, we do work, and I go out there. It was early on writing elements of Surface Encounter about the Dionysian, Apollonian, and Nietzsche, and Heidegger's reading of Dionysus and Apollonian and Nietzsche, and applying it to various artists, and the animality of the animal, or the Dionysian elements of the human. which is to say the divide in us between our animalness and our humanness. And Carrie was really good in seriously engaging me in my thinking, meeting me halfway, listening, and really pushing the work. And so that book came out in his series, Post-Humanities series. But it was his ability to listen. I mean, his take is slightly different. He comes from systems theory and from Derrida, but that ability to have an ally in someone in conversation with was really important. On the art side, it was Mark Wilson and Brynda Schneeboersdottir, whose book Flat Out and Bluesome about polar bears is absolutely transformational, and who I've worked with extensively over the last decade, and who really invited me to push this work further.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
Academics write in our academic modality within our academic world, and it's incredibly important that we do that. But we also have the opportunity to write for broader publics. I've published things on animals in The Atlantic, for example, and I guarantee more people have read that than any academic paper, and possibly all my academic papers combined. And so, if possible, I encourage people to try to at least write one thing or do one thing for the public. Give a public talk, write to a local paper, try to write something for a larger audience, because obviously you have a lot to say. We have a lot to say, but let's translate it beyond our own worlds. And in fact, Animal Revolution is my attempt to do that.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Well, I've already tried handing animals weapons. That didn't work out. I would, in a broad and abstract sense, I would like to have a non-asymmetrical power relationship with animals. If we could imagine something that's other than that. As Wittgenstein says, if a lion could speak, we wouldn't understand it. So the other element there would be, could we just listen to animals and try to understand them?
What are you working on next?
So the next book, I have two modalities. One comes from the chapter you read, and that piece you read about believing in your myths. And so I'm deeply engaging in the history of myths that I've believed in, tried to activate, and looking at the history of these myths and embodiments and putting them into the world. So there's that. And then Karen Bradshaw, who's a colleague here at Arizona State University, she wrote a book 2 years ago called Property Rights for Animals.
Yes, we featured it on this podcast.
Ah, fabulous. Okay, right. So I'm working with Karen to make that to push the Overton window, to make it more possible here in Arizona. And also, we're hoping to go to DC and do some white paper work there to push this idea more broadly into a political conversation.
Fantastic. Well, best of luck with that. How can people find out more about your work?
So probably one of the easiest ways, they're welcome to email me, obviously. If you Google my name, I have a website that has a whole bunch of my artwork as well, art engagements, as well as my published writings, etc. And so that's probably the best way to find out.
Thanks, Ron, for joining us for this podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. You can also follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. And I should say that while my Twitter is very professional, my Instagram contains some more fun things, or fun to me at least. Also, don't forget to tell others about us and to review the podcast on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.